Hello and welcome. These audio recordings are designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam, and today we will go over one of the more common Part C questions found on Paper 1. Remember, Paper 1 is worth 40% of your overall grade, and you will be expected to answer 3 questions, 2 from Section A on the core content, and 1 from Section B on your depth study. Today's topic, if it did turn up in the exam, would be found in Section A. And as always, the question would be broken up into 3 subsections, A, B and C, worth 4, 6 and 10 marks respectively. You may find it useful to have a pen and paper to hand, or it's okay just to listen through as part of your general revision. So today's question is one that you would have studied as part of your Cold War unit. What were the similarities and differences between Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968? Now, in answering this question, many of you will be familiar with PEE. PEE is a technique that history teachers advise for extended writing in examinations. The P represents your point, so every paragraph should be a separate point which is clear and directly links to the question. The middle letter, the E, stands for evidence, and obviously a good point should be supported with precisely selected historical detail. This might be in the form of names, dates, statistics, quotations, people, places, and events. The final letter, the second E, stands for explain. Phrases such as "this evidence shows" or "this evidence suggests" are helpful in achieving this, and better answers will often give more than one layer of explanation. We call this PEE 2.0 because you're doing it twice. So in this response, we will use the PEE formula. So let's get started, shall we? What were the similarities and differences between Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968? This response will give a 6-part scope. 3 PEs arguing that they were similar in some respects. We'll then use the magic words "on the other hand" and proceed to give 3 PEs that suggest events in both countries were different. Let's start with the similarities. Point 1. Causes could be said to be similar in both countries. Evidence to support this includes, well, both countries were communist. Hungary was led by a hardline communist called Matyas Rákosi. There was no freedom of speech, and both countries were police states. In Hungary, people could not wear Western clothes, and there were Soviet troops stationed in the country for which Hungarians had to pay for the privilege of. It was Khrushchev's policy of de-Stalinization and the sense that maybe things were softening that led to the Hungarian Rising. Czechoslovakia, on the other hand, was led by Alexander Dubček. He had proposed socialism with a human face, and he wanted several reforms, including less censorship, more freedom of speech, and a reduction of the powers of the secret police. This was part of what's known as the Prague Spring, in which new ideas were sprouting up. So in explaining this point and evidence, you may wish to explain that both countries were under the Soviet umbrella and that in this sense the causes could be seen to be quite similar. Point 2. Events. Again, in arguing that the events had some similarities, you need to be precise in your application of historical detail or evidence. So you may wish to include some of the following. In June 1956, a group within the Communist Party opposed Rákosi in Hungary, and so the Kremlin replaced him with Enro Giro, and on the 23rd of October 1956, protesters even went so far as to pull down a giant statue of Stalin. The moderate Imre Nagy declared concessions, including free elections, impartial courts, and restoring farmland to private ownership. And so the Soviet response under Khrushchev was to send in tanks and 30,000 troops to Budapest, the capital city, in 1956. There followed 2 weeks of bitter fighting in which 10,000 people were killed and 200,000 fled the country. Nagy himself was executed. 2 weeks later, Khrushchev installed János Kadar as the new leader. 300 people were then executed and a further 35,000 arrested. Many of the rebels in Hungary hoped that Eisenhower, the President of America, might intervene, but he did not. In 1957, a Russian newspaper, Pravda, wrote of the, quote, help, unquote, it had offered the people of Hungary in 1956. Likewise, we could compare the events to those that took place later in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Tanks were also sent in, and over 200,000 Warsaw Pact troops entered Czechoslovakia on the 20th of August 1968. The aim was to bring about normalization. A Prague radio report declared this was, quote, contrary to the basic principles of good relations between socialist states, unquote, on the 21st of August 1968. And although perhaps there was less violence than there was in Hungary, it should be noted that a 20-year-old student, Jan Palach, burnt himself to death in protest in Prague's Wenceslas Square. So in explaining our second similarity for point 2, you may wish to explain that troops and tanks were sent into both to crush the risings. Point 3. Consequences can be said to be quite similar. Evidence for this includes there followed in both countries a mood of despair. Neither had achieved their aims, and they both revealed a vulnerability within the Soviet sphere of influence which had built up after World War II in relation to the way that Soviet satellite states were being ruled. And in explaining this point, you may thus argue that in terms of consequences, there were more similarities here. Okay, time for the magic words. On the other hand. We're now going to give 3 counter-arguments that suggest that events in Hungary in 56 and Czechoslovakia in 68 were rather different. Point 1. Causes. Now, in supporting this with evidence, we've obviously argued in the first half of our essay that one of the causes could be said to be quite similar in that they were both a reaction against Soviet rule. But there are differences in the causes. Hungary had wanted to pull out of the Warsaw Pact entirely, and this risked the breakup of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev would not allow for it. Czechoslovakia, on the other hand, had learnt from this because their uprising took place 12 years later, and so Czechoslovakia had no plans to pull out of the Warsaw Pact. Moreover, whilst there had been troops stationed in Hungary, they were not in Czechoslovakia. So in explaining our first difference, you may wish to argue that although there are some similarities in causes, in actual fact, Hungary was dealt with more harshly because it wanted to pull out of the Warsaw Pact entirely, whereas Czechoslovakia did not intend to. Point 2. Events. Again, we have said there are some similarities in events that took place in the two uprisings. However, there is evidence to suggest they were different also. One piece of evidence is, well, they had different leaders. Nikita Khrushchev was the Soviet leader who had crushed Hungary, but by the time the Czechs were having their uprising, Leonid Brezhnev was in charge. Brezhnev had tried various other methods, including slowing down reform, and when tanks entered Czechoslovakia on the 20th of August 1968, there was little violent resistance. Instead, there was mass uncooperation. Moreover, Dubček was removed from power, but he wasn't executed like Nagy had been in Hungary. Instead, he was sent to work in Turkey as an ambassador. So again, in explaining this point, you may wish to outline that there were some differences in events that took place, notably in the leaders and also in what happened to the leaders of both countries. Finally, point 3. The consequences could be said to be rather different. Evidence to support this includes events in Czechoslovakia led to what was known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. This meant when a threat of revolution against communist rule occurred in one satellite state, it represented, quote, a concern for all socialist countries, unquote. This policy or doctrine was only abandoned in 1989 by Mikhail Gorbachev. And so, in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that it wasn't until Czechoslovakia that the consequences led to the Brezhnev Doctrine. So, to sum up, what were the similarities and differences between Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968? We have said that they were similar in terms of causes, events, and consequences, and likewise that there were differences in causes, events, and consequences. Okay, let's finish off with a clever conclusion. Historian Steve Phillips says the two events were, quote, to some extent a repeat, unquote. Both examples highlighted the manner in which Soviet rule over Eastern Europe was managed, with an iron fist in a velvet glove. There were similarities in some ways and differences in others, but what can be shown in both are the first real cracks in Soviet rule, which were to lead to the eventual breakup of the Soviet Union in 1989 under the helm of Mikhail Gorbachev. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. If you did, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Mr. Guiney History, or you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye!